All right, so hello, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service here in Hancock County, joining you by Zoom. Today, we are going to take a tour through the taxonomic group, the insects, something that I'm really interested in. There's just a fantastic amount of diversity, and I'm just going to get started with some sort of really basic stuff and just kind of defining what we mean when we talk about the insects. Of course, that's the class Insecta. If you remember from learning about taxonomy, we have different groups that are more or less inclusive as we go up a tree, starting with kingdoms and then going to phyla and then classes. So insects are arthropods. Like the other arthropods, they have an exoskeleton that has a huge amount of impact on the way they live, of course, because that skeleton is on the outside. They do need to go through molts in order to grow and go through their different life stages. We very commonly here in Mississippi will run into the cast-off exoskeleton of cicadas hanging on trees or hanging on even on the walls of houses and things like that. You can see a really good picture there of an adult insect coming out from that exoskeleton and emerging and getting ready to let those to give those wings a try. Another quality that insects have is that they have three pairs of walking legs. And so you can see that same cicada, a little bit more mature there. See a really good image of the three pairs of legs. Sometimes there are some modifications of those legs. My favorite picture of a mantis there, really demonstrating how those front legs have been modified. They call them raptorial or hunting forelegs. And so it tends to walk around on the second and third pair of legs using that first pair for hunting. And there are other modifications that you may see in the legs of insects in other groups. Another important thing to describe insects is that they have three body sections. Always start off with the head. That's where they keep their eyes and their antennae and their mouth parts. Their thorax is going to be where you find the legs, and in adult insects, the wings. And then the abdomen, of course, has the digestive system, the reproductive system, kind of what passes for a circulatory system for insects. We'll often say that insects have two pairs of wings. There are some really great examples here. Of course, we can see the butterfly, and you can see the hind wings and how they're connected to the forewing. Of course, we also have the beetle there in the bottom right, and you can see how that front pair of wings is modified into that hard shell. It's where the group of beetles gets their name. But the hind wings are really clear and obvious when it spreads them. But of course, you also have insects like the flies, where they only have that one set of flying wings, and the hind wings are modified down to just some tiny little stumps that we call halteres. And then you also have insects like the ants, where they don't have wings at all of their stages. So despite the fact that we will say that insects have two pairs of wings, again, because there's so much diversity in the insects, we see a lot of variation in that as well. One thing that's really important when we talk about insects is their life stages, and we've talked about this before. These life stages are really important because the way that these insects live can be very different at different life stages. The immatures may be aquatic, where the adult is terrestrial. They may feed on different things and really have very drastically different ecologies when we think about these different life stages. We tend to group the way that insects pass through their life cycles in two different groups. There's what we call incomplete metamorphosis, where the insect starts off as an egg, It comes out of that egg as what we'll call a nymph. Sometimes you'll hear the term naiad used, particularly for aquatic insects. That goes through a number of different stages and then comes out of another molt as the adult, which of course is going to be really easy to tell because it has wings. In complete metamorphosis, we're going to go through one extra life stage. Again, you're starting off as an egg, going into a larval stage, where you might be, talking about caterpillars or grubs or maggots and things like that. And then they're going to go into a pupal stage, and in that pupal stage, they radically change into what that adult form is going to be. So, that's the classic thing of the butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. But you'll see that in other groups of insects like the beetles and flies and things like that. So insects have been really significant in human society, and we're going to talk about a little bit, just some notes on that as we go on. Of course, I am in agriculture or horticulture, and so I tend to think of that first. And one of the things that I like to use is art as a way to kind of show the cultural significance of insects. And so there's two images here. The first of these is a petroglyph that's found on a rock shelter in South Africa. You can kind of faintly see it there, but there is a petroglyph of a grasshopper, which shows how significant they are, going back thousands of years. Much more recently, there's a really nice painting by Clara Southern. That's in Australia, I believe. And it's an old bee farm, and you can see someone out tending the beehive. So insects have been significant for us as humans for a really long time, and I think they're certainly interesting. And because I like art, there is some really interesting use of insects in art. Of course, you can see up at the top right there, kind of a descriptive drawing of a moth or butterfly. Um, and of course, those were used as kind of a way to record all of the animals or organisms or animals and plants that people encountered. And you can find some great old books where these plates are reproduced and see some of those fantastic drawings. Of course, you can see down in the bottom there a more decorative use of insects in art. And then there's a really interesting example of kind of a more modern art there using a jewel beetle and including all those kind of interesting gears. So one of the things that's really fascinating about insects is how many different kinds of them there are. There are far and away more different kinds of insects described than any other group of organisms on the planet. Right now, there's about a little bit more than 1 million different described species of insects. That information's a little bit old, so by now, certainly more than that. And we estimate that the total number of insect species in the world could be anywhere from 3 million to 30 million. I've seen a lot of estimates around 10 million, so there's still a great deal of diversity for us to discover. And I always like to kind of put things in perspective when we talk about all of the different species of plants that we have described. We've described maybe 350,000 different kinds of plants. So about 3 times as many insects as we've described plants. Just kind of another interesting thing, are all these really nice insect displays that you can see. And often you can go places and they'll have insectariums where these are displayed. Down in New Orleans, they have a really great insectarium with some really interesting collections of all the great diversity. And so if you ever have the opportunity to visit one of those places, I really encourage you to do that. And just there's a fantastic amount of interest you can take in that. all of the different ways that the insects live and interact with their environment. But they can also just be fantastically beautiful. You can see right on the very far right those really brilliant blue butterflies. Just a great deal of variety. So as we're talking about variety, what I'd like to do is just kind of run through a lot of the different groups of insects. And I want to start with a proviso that I know I have excluded a couple of different groups. Um, so this is not complete, but I tried to hit the ones that you're going to encounter and make sure that I mentioned them. But there are some insects that I'm not going to mention as I go through this, just because there's so much diversity that covering it in the time that I have would be really difficult. So I want to start off with one of the more what we'd call primitive insects. These are the springtails. The order name for that, or the fancy name for that, is Columbella. We call them springtails. If you look at the middle picture there, you can see that a little projection at the end of its abdomen. That is called a furcula. And that attaches to the middle of its body and just is held under tension. And so when the insect might be threatened, or if it needs to move a little bit, it can release that tension. It'll actually jump, sort of jump across, and they can spring a remarkable distance for an insect that really on average is going to be less than a half a centimeter in length. Columbella are usually found in the soil. There can be an awful lot of them, particularly in the soil at the base of trees and in forests. There might be as many as 100,000 springtails per square meter of soil, which is an awful lot. And occasionally you will run into them when you are working out in the garden, or if you're working out in mulch. You might see some really tiny things jumping around, and it's really likely that what you're seeing, just little specks, are going to be springtails. Another old group of insects are the silverfish and firebrats. When I was in school, we called this the group Thysanura. As I was getting ready for this presentation, I discovered that the taxonomists had changed the name to the Zygentoma. That does happen, and as I have learned taxonomy, I have had to go back and update things as we kind of understand the relationship between different groups a little bit more. Silverfish, probably what we're more likely to encounter out in the wild. They tend to feed on decaying matter and leaf litter. We can always tell silverfish. They have that kind of flattened appearance. They are really soft-bodied, don't have any wings, and they have those two projections that come off the end of the abdomen there. And we do tend to find them in older buildings, any places where they can live undisturbed. They like moist environments, and they'll feed on old newspaper and old books. You can see up there in the top left, damage done to a book by silverfish. Firebrats I don't run into very often. They prefer warm places, and that's where they get their name, but they look really similar to the silverfish. A really interesting group of insects are the mayflies. They have the name for their group is Hymenoptera. Whenever you see that, of course, that the ptera part of that means winged, and the first part of that, ephemeral, is kind of a reference to the fact that the adults don't last very long. They take flights. Oftentimes, they will emerge synchronized, so you will have massive numbers of mayflies all coming out at the same time in large swarms. They mate in those swarms, and very shortly afterwards, the adults are gone. The immatures can actually live for several years. They're aquatic. They live in streams and other areas like that, streams and ponds. Mayflies are a really interesting group, not only because of that interesting life cycle, how they come out in huge numbers. They're the only insect that undergoes a second molt after they have a wing stage. So they have what they call a sub-imago, which is kind of like a junior adult, and then the imago or adult stage. You can also often tell mayflies because they have really interesting eyes. You can see that in that top picture where they kind of have a downward facing eye and then an upward facing eye, so they can see all of the other mayflies going around in that swarm. You'll often see these. They can be drawn to lights, and so you will sometimes you'll stop at a gas station or something like that, and you'll see a large number of mayflies gathered around, particularly if you're near a good water source. Dragonflies and damselflies, of course, we're familiar with these. Really easy to tell the dragonflies apart. They have that really long, extended abdomen. Even more striking, really long, thin abdomen in the damselflies. Dragonflies are really notable because of their wings, really intricately veined. And unlike a lot of the other insects, their wings are independent, so they're not linked together. Makes them incredibly agile in flight. They also have really large eyes, really prominent on their head, and that's because they're flying predators. They're the only insect that I'm aware of will actually catch its prey out of the air. You'll often see them patrolling up and down streams because the immatures, again, are aquatic, and the name for this group refers to their teeth. Their larvae, or the naiads for the dragonflies and damselflies, are kind of alpha predators for the invertebrates in aquatic systems. If you ever want to tell the difference between a dragonfly and a damselfly, that's really easy to do. The dragonflies have their wings held out to the side. They can't fold them back over their back. The damselflies do keep their wings folded back like you see in the picture there. Of course, we're all familiar with grasshoppers and crickets in the group Orthoptera. We often use grasshoppers and crickets kind of as a model when we're talking about insects, because they have a really kind of a easy to see layout. We can kind of point out all the different parts. Of course, the most characteristic thing for this order are the hind legs being modified for jumping. Crickets we normally find in detritus and living in the soil. Of course, grasshoppers we do occasionally encounter as pests in a variety of different environments. This is the mole cricket we in Mississippi are regretfully aware of. You can see the modification of those forward legs really makes it easy for it to dig through the soil. Really not the most attractive insect in the world, and can be a serious pest of lawns. When we talk about pest grasshoppers, though, there certainly is the most striking example of that, and that are the locusts. And locusts are essentially grasshoppers that have decided to all get together and form a huge swarm. And these swarms can be incredibly devastating, just occur in large numbers and eat just anything that comes up in their path. And of course, there is a long history and references to plagues of locusts can be found in a variety of very old books. The phasmata or phasmatodea, depends on who you go and talk to, are the walking sticks. Really interesting set of insects here. Tend to be wingless or have drastically reduced wings. The most common walking stick that I run into here in Mississippi is the two-striped walking stick you see there on the left. Can often find those in the summer on surfaces, or there occasionally you'll find the male and the female together. What you see pictured there is the female. You always want to be careful picking them up. They can't actually spit at you, and they kind of spit a stream. If it gets into your eyes, it can be quite painful. But the most really striking thing about these insects is how they're modified to be sort of disguised or camouflaged as sticks. You can see a really good example of that in the other image here, as a way to discourage predation. Of course, they eat leaves, though they aren't significant pests by any regard. They do actually keep walking sticks as pets. I had one, or had several that I kept as demonstration animals for quite a while. Really interesting, tend to be slow moving, but an interesting group of insects. Earwigs generally are one of the insects that people tend to look at and have a little bit of a disgust reaction. There's, of course, a fascinating story about different stories about how people think they got that name. Um, the most distinguishing feature of them is that those two kind of hook-like appendages on the back of their body called cerci. Um, but earwigs generally aren't damaging. They live in old plant matter, and you'll find them in mulch fairly frequently. They tend to be active in the evening, so you don't tend to see them at all during the day unless you go disturbing the area that they're in. And of course, there's all sorts of stories about how earwigs got their name because they would crawl into people's ears and lay eggs or things like that. That is not the case. That's not where they got the name. It actually comes from Old English. They got the ear part of that comes from their hind wings, which kind of have an ear-like shape to them. And the wig part of that is an Old English word that means insect or beetle. I can't pronounce Old English very well, but it was something like wigga. So that's where they get that name, but generally harmless and nothing to be concerned about if you see it. Lacewings and antlions are insects that are in the group called the Neuroptera. We are hopefully all familiar with the green lacewing and brown lacewing because their larvae are beneficial insects that we might find in our garden. They will feed on aphids and whiteflies and things like that. The green lacewing adult does the same thing, though the green lacewing adult tends to feed on flower nectar. The brown lacewing adult still feeds on aphids. Another member of this group is the antlion. You can see that attractive fella in the other image there. Not the most charming of insects, but usually found at the bottom of those kind of cone-like structures in the sand, waiting for a hapless insect to come along and tumble down to the bottom. The insect is waiting in there to capture it and feed on it. When I was very young, we'd go out and have little pieces of pine straw or things like that, and try to catch the antlions by poking that down into that hole, which was certainly hours of fun. As we might define fun, I don't know. Another really interesting insect that looks really fierce but really isn't. This is the Dobson fly. They are, you see there the male Dobson fly and then the female Dobson fly. The male Dobson fly has those really remarkably long mandibles that look really fierce. The female has much shorter mandibles on it. Funnily enough, the bite from the male really doesn't have enough force to be serious. The female Dobson fly actually has fairly strong mandibles and can give you a pretty nasty pinch if you're handling them. They have those really long net-like wings. We often see them coming to lights during the summer. So if you have a light out outside your house, you might see one of these flying. The larvae are aquatic, like a lot of what we've discussed so far, and are really popular as bait for fishing. They're called hellgrammites. I've tried to find an origin to that name, and I've not come up with it. But they are very commonly used in fishing, and you can actually see some trout lures and things like that that are kind of modeled after these Dobson flies. Another aquatic insect as a larvae. This is a stonefly. Scientific name for that is Plecoptera. Really found in fast moving rocky streams, really clear streams. And the immatures are very often found under rocks. Different groups of the stoneflies have different areas that they prefer. Some groups like to hang out under large rocks. Some groups like to hang out under gravel. And when I was taking aquatic entomology many years ago, what we would do in order to try to find stoneflies is we would put a barrier downstream of us, get in the water, and start kind of kicking up the gravel and turning over stones, and kind of hoping that they would be swept downstream. You can easily tell the stoneflies because if you look very closely in that top image, you'll actually see the gills coming off from the sides of that adult, or the sides from that immature. The really kind of the one of the significant things about stoneflies is that they are incredibly sensitive to water pollution. Anything that negatively impacts a stream that would decrease the amount of oxygen that's in that stream is going to unfortunately do a lot of harm to the stonefly population. And so, because of that, we can really easily use them when we're looking at stream health. We can look at the population of stoneflies and other insects that are in there and really get a good idea of what's going on with the health of that waterway by looking at the insect populations that we see there. All right, this is or a group of insects I often get questions about. This is a group called the Socoptera. The more common one we're going to run into is what you're going to see in that top image there. It's really the same thing in the bottom image, just a kind of a different species. Those are bark lice. Sometimes they are referred to as tree cattle. They aggregate together or group together on the trunks of trees. And I'll often get pictures of them sent to me, and people asking me what they are and whether they're damaging the plant. They're actually kind of beneficial. They run around and they eat algae and lichen and things like that, and do no harm to the tree whatsoever. So the other side of this group are the book lice. They are quite a bit smaller and wingless, tend to be found indoors. They're kind of my wife. My wife is a librarian, so they're her worst nightmare because they like to feed on things like book binding or wallpaper paste and things like that. But that's where they get the term book lice. All right, one of the worst insects we can talk about. This is the termite, the group Isoptera. Really easy to tell the winged adults because the Isoptera means equal wings. So their hind wings and their forewings are pretty much the same size. Of course, they are extraordinarily damaging pests of structures. If they get into structures, they can cause just a fantastic amount of damage by feeding on wood. They have bacteria that are in their gut that allow them to digest cellulose, where most things aren't able to actually eat the wood and get any nutritive benefit from it. Termites are able to do that. Of course, we have a number of different termites here in Mississippi. Eastern subterranean termite, the drywood termite, and the Formosan termite. Of course, if we look at other areas of the world, they have other groups of termites. So this is a mound building termite, and you'll see these in Africa and some areas of South America and Australia, and that is essentially just one huge termite mound, and they can be quite large. being several meters tall, twice as tall or more than a person, and really large around, with just massive numbers of termites found in those. And it's interesting, the termites, the mounds will often survive long after the termites have gone away, and so you'll see those mounds standing for a significant amount of time. Oftentimes, people have difficulty telling termites and ants apart, because they tend to be flying in the spring and things like that. Of course, we can go back and remember termites. That term isoptera means their wings are going to be equal sizes, though oftentimes when we find them, the wings have fallen off, and so that's not particularly useful. But really, the easiest thing, if we can look at them really closely, we can see on that ant, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. That ant has a kind of a really narrow waist, whereas the termite doesn't. So if you can see that waist and see how the ant has that kind of narrow waist, while the termite has kind of a broad waist, that really is kind of a simple way to tell termites and ants apart. One of my favorite groups of insects, this is the mantis or the Mantodea. Of course, the praying mantis is the most famous member of this group. And the word mantis has an interesting history. It's Greek for prophet or soothsayer. Of course, the most significant thing we notice about mantises is that modification of the forelimbs into those raptorial legs, where they use those to catch prey. They also have those really prominent eyes. Of course, this is a large example. We see all sorts of different, much smaller mantises as well. Mantises are winged. That often does come as a surprise to people. But another really good example of kind of an apex predator in the insect world. Less pleasantly, there are the cockroaches. This is the order Bladodea. We are very familiar here in Mississippi with the big American cockroach that we tend to find outside. As much as we tend to kind of go ew when we see them, cockroaches are remarkably clean, clean themselves very frequently. Um, the large roaches don't tend to be problems getting them inside, though the German cockroach that you see in that lower picture really is just a pest that's associated with getting in houses, and can be a kind of a trial to get rid of. Most important thing to do to get rid of German cockroaches is clean up the area and sanitize as much as you can, and then call a pest control operator, because it's just going to be a lot easier to hire somebody than it would be to get rid of them otherwise. The Hymenoptera, or the thrips, are a small group of insects that are common pests in a range of different plants. The most common one that we run into are the flower thrips. There's the eastern flower thrips and the flower thrips. If you ever want to win a game of Scrabble, or if you need to answer a question on Jeopardy, the singular form of thrips is thrips. It has the S on it. Many years ago, I made the mistake of saying thrip in front of our thrips specialist, and I got to spend the next several days with a microscope keying out thrips for him to tell him what they were, and I've never made that mistake again. When you look at them under, of course, they're quite tiny. They're very very small insects. When you look at them under the microscope, as you see them pictured there on the left, you can see those really interesting kind of hairs that they have on their wings. They tend to be, you tend to find them in flowers fairly commonly, but a significant pest in a lot of different crops. We are often familiar with the true bugs in a lot of different names, in a lot of different groups. That's the Hemiptera. You can see, of course, the cicada there. as well as some aphids. I'll take just a few minutes to talk about a few of these. Aphids, of course, we're familiar with as plant pests. Easy to identify because you see those two little projections coming off their hind end. And aphids they like all true bugs, they suck plant sap out of the plants with kind of a needle-like mouth part, and they can grow to very, very high populations very quickly because they can do something called parthenogenesis. In parthenogenesis, the female aphid can give birth to more female aphids without a male ever being involved, which allows their population to grow very, very quickly. Most of the times they don't have wings. Every few generations, you will have some winged aphids born and some male aphids, and they'll fly around and spread to new locations. But a significant plant pest, and one of the really significant things about aphids is that they can, like some other insects, transmit plant viruses, which can make them really significant pests in different crops. And of course, we're all familiar with the stink bugs. There's a variety of these. The green stink bug and the brown stink bug are really common, and we do now have the brown marmorated stink bug. Really serious pests in row crops and in vegetables and in home landscapes. Piercing, sucking mouth parts can cause fruit abortion. Really kind of decline the appearance of things. And they do have a defensive chemical that makes them smell unpleasant, which is where they get that name, stink bug. They have kind of that shield-like appearance. The family name for them is Pentatomidae, which kind of references how they kind of look like they have that five-sided shield shape. Going off into just some interesting diversity here. If you've ever heard the term shellac, shellac is a resin that is used in woodworking and making musical instruments, all sorts of other things, making felt hats and leather shoes and waxes. And shellac comes from a scale insect, which is also in that Hymenoptera group called Laccifer lacca. That's found on soapberry and acacia trees in India and in Burma. And that sticky resin is the primary ingredient of shellac. And to make a single gram of lac, you need 200 insects. So that's 90,000 of these insects per pound of lac in order to make shellac. So you can see a picture there up in the top of the actual shellac and the Laccifer lacca insects on the tree there. So if you ever pick up an old violin and feel that resin, that's what that is. Another scale insect with some interesting uses. This is cochineal scale. Cochineal scale has been used for a very, very long time to make red dye. You can see an old painting there. It's also extensively been used in food dyes, and most of the time they don't use this anymore, but it's been used to make pink and red coloring in some food products, including the ones that you see pictured there. It's also used in makeup and a variety of other things. One of the things that I really think that it makes a brilliant color in old clothing and old paintings, and the paintings that you see here use that dye made from cochineal for that brilliant red color. Particularly, you see the turban has that really nice color. It's also used in making fabrics and rugs and things like that. So old items with that red color very likely use cochineal dye. Less pleasantly, there are the fleas. We're all familiar with fleas, particularly if we have cats or dogs. But of course, fleas can get on people too. and get on rats. They are parasites, so they feed on blood with kind of a piercing, sucking mouth part. They have a really flattened body, flattened kind of side to side, make it really easy for them to move through hair. And of course, they're famous for being able to jump very far for the size of the insect that they are. Of course, fleas are implicated as the vector of a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which is likely to have been, though there's some disputing of that, the cause of the Black Plague in Europe. So, not the most pleasant thing, but certainly an instance where insects have really significantly impacted human civilization. And there, if you go back, to art in the time period, there's all sorts of depictions of the figure of death and depictions of the Black Death in Europe in art. Another unpleasant one. These are lice in the group the Theraptera. They spelled that in the most complicated way that they could get away with. But two different groups. They're either sucking lice or chewing lice, both of which are unpleasant. And many of us, as we were going through elementary school, would have outbreaks of lice in school, things like that. All right, these are the flies, the Diptera. Diptera literally means two wings, and as I mentioned earlier, the hind wings on flies are modified down into what's called halteres, and they really just use their forewings for flying. Of course, on the right there, you have what we would think of as kind of the common housefly, whereas on the left there, that is a bee fly or a hoverfly, which is a beneficial insect in gardens, both as a pollinator and because the immatures will feed on aphids. But they have those really brilliant colors. You'll find them where they're that nice kind of yellow color. You'll also find green ones and just all sorts of different really bright colors. Some interesting, again, historical note. There was a figure or an image that became very popular maybe 20 years ago and maybe a little bit more, of this figure called Kokopele, which is a figure in Hopi culture. In Hopi culture, Kokopele was a fertility deity, both for fertility and for agriculture. And there are different stories about the appearance of Kokopele, and in some of those, it's kind of a depiction of Aztec merchants or merchants from other cultures who carry a bag on their back and play a flute. But a lot of the depictions of Kokopele are kind of insectile, and they are there's a lot of hint there that the figure was associated with the robber fly, which you see pictured on here. Robber flies are predaceous flies. They hunt other insects, but they have that really pronounced hump and kind of long mouth part there that kind of gives that general appearance. And so I always appreciated that people were getting a picture of a robber fly tattooed on them or putting them on the back of their cars. Of course, we can't talk about the impact of flies without talking about the mosquito. There are, of course, worldwide, malaria is still a very serious disease. We're fortunate here in the United States that we do not have problems with transmission of malaria, despite the fact we do have some mosquito species that could potentially carry it. And of course, a lot of that is down to managing mosquito populations and just not being exposed to things. Be glad whenever the spray truck comes by to get rid of mosquitoes. Thank them a little bit because they are doing good work. Of course, malaria is a very serious disease in South America, Asia, and Africa, and other areas of the world. Beetles. We could spend many different presentations talking about the beetles. Their name, Coleoptera, means stone wing, and that is a reference to that front pair of wings being modified into that hardened elytra, or hardened wing that we call an elytra. One of my favorite stories about beetles, and I will preface this with, it's one of those stories that may well be kind of a apocryphal, or it's a story. How true it is up for question. There was a biologist by the name of J.B.S. Haldane, and he was asked by a religious authority what he had learned about the Creator in all of his study of life. And his response to that was that the Creator has an inordinate fondness for beetles. Beetles are by themselves the largest group of insects, with more than 350,000 described species. The two that you see here pictured, one of those is a diving beetle that's aquatic, and they're really interesting because they have hairs on their body that allow them to trap air and swim around through the water very quickly. There are several different groups of aquatic beetles. One of my favorites is the whirligig beetle, which is named that because if you disturb them on the surface of the water, they'll swim in circles very quickly. The other picture you see there is of the eastern Hercules beetle, which is one of the largest beetles we have here in the United States, which is quite large. You can see from the picture that it's kind of very similar. It's a rhinoceros beetle, so it has that nice horn on the front of it, particularly in the males. And I keep trying to find one of these for my personal collection, and I have been stymied in that so far. But a really interesting beetle. One of the beetles we very frequently run into, this is the chafer beetle, also known as May beetles or June bugs and things like that. The immature stage is the white grub that we'll occasionally talk about as being a lawn pest. The adult is often found flying to lights at night. So the brown and black beetles that you see around your lights in the evening are chafer beetle. Of course, one of the really significant beetles that we have dealt with in the United States is the boll weevil, a major pest, kind of defining pest for cotton, and a real success in terms of the eradication process that was done for that to get rid of the boll weevil and sort of fight it back into its native range. One of the kind of an interesting note about that, these pictures are from Enterprise, Alabama, where they have a monument to the boll weevil. And it says, in profound appreciation of the boll weevil and what it has done as the herald of prosperity, this monument was erected by the citizens of Enterprise, Coffee County, Alabama. And essentially, that it prompted them to diversify their production away from cotton. Of course, we have the bees and wasps. We all know the carpenter bee is boring into wood, a number of different species. And we all know and love the European honeybee, which pollinates about a sixth of the world's different flowering species, 400 different kinds of agricultural plants. And having bees is really one of the few things we can do that significantly increases yield as opposed to just protecting yield. Keeping and protecting our honeybees is really important. A good example of that is the almond crop in California, where we move about 1.6 million colonies of honeybees to California to orchards in order to make sure that the almond crop blooms, which in some years at least was 85% of the available commercial hives in the United States, all going to California in order to preserve and produce those almonds. So enjoy those almonds the next time you see them, and thank a bee. Another kind of interesting one for the Hymenoptera, some of the wasps will lay their eggs in trees and cause the formation of what are called galls. You can see some of those up in the top right. And they actually use this to make what they call tannic acid ink. Occasionally, you'll hear it referred to as oak gall tea. You shouldn't drink it, but they make ink out of this. And so some of the early documents in the United States were written out of this oak gall ink, and you can see some examples of that here. Just a quick note, I'm going to go through some of these pretty quickly. These are the Strepsiptera, or twisted wing parasites, and you can see they're parasites of other insects, and you can see if you look closely at the end of that wasp's body, those blackish projections coming out of it are actually other insects parasitizing that bee. Those are the Strepsiptera. Of course, we all love butterflies and the moths, not always when they're caterpillars, because they can be significant pests in agriculture and in our gardens. One of the really significant historical things for butterflies and for moths, of course, is the production of silk, which is produced by the silkworm moth, Bombyx mori. That was developed in China sometime, 2700 BC, and was tightly and fiercely guarded as a trade good and a special good for the nobility. Anyone who revealed how they made silk was sentenced to death. But of course, that knowledge escaped and spread first to Japan and India, to the Persian Empire, and finally to Europe in the 6th century. But one of the things that's really significant is that long trade route all the way from Europe to Beijing, China, all the way across the Middle East and Asia, connecting the Roman Empire to China. Of course, one of the things we really love about butterflies are their wings. All sorts of art has been done with this, using the wings of the butterflies to make these really just fascinating patterns, really attractive. Just again, going to mention some of these really quickly. These are the caddisflies in the group Trichoptera. Literally means hairy wing, because they have hairs on their wings. Most interesting thing about them is that they're immatures, live in water, and they make protective cases for themselves out of rocks and sometimes out of twigs and things like that. You can see an example of that in that upper image, where it's made all sorts of really colorful rocks all around itself. Looks really attractive. And the way that they do that is species specific. So different caddisflies make different little cases for themselves. Though if you give them different materials, an artist decided to give caddisflies jewelry. So he gave it little particles of gold and little particles of gems to make cases out of themselves. And those just came out really attractive. You can see that in that lower image. Just kind of an interesting note, I mentioned that insects are really diverse. And we often think that we've discovered everything that's out there. So this is the Notoptera, not one you're likely to run into. The ice crawlers live in really, really high mountains and freezing conditions where you wouldn't think you would find an insect. But you also have the rock crawlers and what are fancifully called the gladiator insects. Gladiators are the most recently described group of insects. We have only known about them for about 18 years. So as long as we've lived with bugs, we are still discovering more and more of them. And I think there's certainly a lot more that we're going to be able to learn over time. And there's a lot of ways that we're going to interact with insects in the future. Of course, MSU has an insect rearing center and runs a rearing workshop every year because insects are potentially are a food in a lot of places. Not always for people. And I know here in the West, we are not really attracted to the idea of eating bugs. But in other areas of the world, it's quite common. And it's also quite common as a food for livestock or things like that, because it can be produced with a lot less water and a lot less feed in order to produce the protein that those animals need. And so they run rearing workshops so we can learn to raise insects efficiently and cleanly so that there's no bacterial contamination, anything like that. So I appreciate it. I'm going to close out. I know I may have horrified some people with those last images. But so I'm going to close out with this really gorgeous picture of a butterfly and jewel beetle. Because one of the things, of course, that I really appreciate about insects is all of the beauty that can be seen in this group.